Hi everyone, I'm Glenn Deason and I'm joined today by Pascal Lottaz, a Swiss assistant professor working in Japan and also the host of the very popular Neutrality Studies podcast. Well, I guess your main research obviously is neutrality. We contributed to the same book once on this topic. We presented together in Washington, D.C. I think also with the Ministry of Defense there. Perhaps this, yeah, very fitting for you. It's in your Swiss blood, the neutrality aspect that is. And Nonetheless, I can't help but to notice that how we speak of neutrality, it appears to have changed a bit. It used to be considered a moral position, a recipe for peace, for promoting diplomacy. Indeed, neutral states tended to be natural mediators, so that's why the world leaders would always meet in Finland or Switzerland. But again, I think an interesting development is that over the past 3 decades, and especially intensifying over the past 3 years, neutrality has become almost wiped out in Europe, and also the way we speak of neutrality has changed. So, how do you read all of this? Do you consider why is neutrality so important, I guess, and how do you see that topic changing?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very glad to be on your podcast. And we have a history that goes back to 2019 and this very nice conference on permanent neutrality, which funnily enough happened in Washington, D.C. So I'm quite glad that the academic discourse about even abstract topics like this still work. And a lot of viewers who will watch this video, they will just shake their head and say, like, what neutrality? I mean, how is Switzerland still neutral? How is Austria still neutral in this very polarized environment where these countries pick the side, right? It's utterly clear that the Swiss and the Austrians and the Irish to a good degree as well chose to be with the West and put sanctions on Russia and are on board with basically anything that Israel does. I mean, how can we still describe such behavior as neutral? And as you said, in Europe in general, Finland and Sweden, we just lost them as neutrals. And the cynics will say, like, yeah, well, they haven't been truly neutral forever. And other cynics will say Switzerland has never been neutral. I mean, the Second World War, the gold, the Nazis, how is that neutrality? Now, part of what I do at my university is try to take this whole thing apart and then study how certain actors that are not directly involved in warfare, how they act. And I frame that as third party politics, And yes, cynically speaking, neutrality is at least moving out at the moment of Europe. But interestingly enough, neutrality as third-party actors in conflict is actually gaining in strength globally. It's moving into the wider world. I mean, if we look at what's happening around BRICS, and if we look at how certain countries in the global South are positioning themselves, they explicitly say we do not take part in this conflict, and some of them explicitly call that neutrality. And most interestingly, the Malaysians. Malaysia is now this year 2025 the chair of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and the Minister of the Economy just recently in December wrote an article in one of the newspapers saying that neutrality is ASEAN's greatest asset. He says, like, ASEAN as a group of 10, now 11 countries is a neutral force, and it will not pick sides. And that is a huge asset because we can trade and work with everybody. So the discussion is changing, and we know as historians as well, right? Over time, concepts change, language about it changes, and my claim is that it makes sense if we try to also focus not just on the conflicting parties, but also on these third parties, because often conflicts develop dynamics which engulf the third parties as well. Even though these third parties, these neutrals, they try to stay out of the primary conflict, they try not to go to the fighting, but the overall conflict constellation, it's like a frame that's around everything, that they're very much incorporated into the conflict constellation, the entire dynamic of it, because like naturally belligerents or conflict parties will try to influence third parties, and you can see that how the Americans and the Europeans are doing this like with a lot of violence, right? They are trying to trash talk anyone and everyone who's currently still trading with Russia, right? Because in their view, everybody should just stop everything with Russia and disregard all of their previous interests and just do what the EU and the US says, and then you would beat Russia. And you can see how the not defeat, the ongoing ability of Russia to engage in warfare with Ukraine, how the Europeans and the Americans are blaming that on third states. First it was the Chinese, then it's the North Koreans, and you know this shadow fleet of other countries, or like Russian shadow fleet that dare to sail to countries that are not participating in these sanctions. And this kind of pressure is very, very normal. It's very old. And throughout history, we see that third parties are constantly somehow being engaged, and they're being pushed and pulled. And sometimes they cooperate more with one or the other belligerent, and sometimes less. And well, that's my neutrality studies.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting what you said that while neutrality is falling in Europe, or if not collapsing in the rest of the world, you're seeing a big embrace of it also in the form of yeah, non-alignment, not joining blocks. Again, the world is becoming more like India, I guess, which would be
Yeah.
a positive development. And I think this is
Precisely.
often,
And you know, the Indian foreign minister, Jay Shankar, he in 2022, late 22 or early 23, he was at this at a big discussion meeting, and he was pushed by the anchor of the conference, saying like, you know, at the end of the day, it is clear every country has to pick a side. Which side will you be on? And he said like, look, I reject this framing. That's not what we do. Well, India is on India's side. I am 1.3 billion people. I have the right to my own side. So I reject that. And the anchor, it didn't, the interviewer didn't really sink in. She kept saying, like, yeah, but at the end of the day, you know, when push comes to shove, you have to pick sides. And that is a very, very European and Anglo-American way of understanding the world. And it's, of course, something that then neutrals, whether officially or just in an analytical sense, that they try to escape. And now, in fact, you know, the part of the world that is able to escape this is growing. Just think of the pre-45 world, where large parts of the global south was occupying, right? With colonies. And automatically, when their parent state went to war, they also had to go to war. I mean, the First and Second World War would not have been world wars had it not been for the occupation of all of these places. And just the sheer fact that now the global south is much more independent. There's still like neo-colonial influences, and the West still tries to put its thumb on them and push them into one or the other direction. But today, institutionally, a lot of global south countries are able to say like, no, neither you nor you. I'm not going to participate. I'm going to do what's good for me. And actually, I will try to trade with both of you. And I don't care if you cut each other's throats. You're idiots. I'm not going to participate, but I will still trade with you because obviously, why not?
yeah, but this is why I think it's very difficult to mention the journalists trying to wrap their head around this. And I see this analysis often whenever the Saudis begin to trade closer with China. The journalists will come along and, well, are they joining China as a bloc now? And we only think in this blocks. Like, do you belong to our grouping or theirs? So this very extreme, I guess, tribalism. But you see now around the world, as someone who lives in Europe, I find it quite depressing to see the rapid decline. However, one benefit, of course, is that when the world was excessively Western centric, is the rest of the world had little option but to join in. But as India also points out often, is somehow India's problems is never Europe's problem, but Europe's problem always have to be India's problem. So they always have to pick a side. But it's very destructive, and
That's
especially.
from exactly that speech that he
Yeah,
gave. Exactly that one. Yeah.
I think we watched the same speech.
Yeah.
But but no, but I think it's also the shift in power as the world becomes more multipolar. Abandoning neutrality can be quite destructive because you tie yourself to one. If you have a conflict, for example, between the U.S. now or NATO and Russia, if you pick a side, you will isolate yourself from one of those sides, create a hostile relationship, and you might develop excessive dependence on the other. So but also, what, for example, India and others are saying is what we used to say, that neutrality is good. It prevents conflicts from escalating. It prevents it from spreading, and even this whole dialogue discourse that are they aligning with China? China is very explicitly neutral. Or not just neutral in this conflict, even though Russia is their most important partner. They say they're neutral, they're not taking side. Indeed, they sold the drones and such to Ukraine as well, but also in terms of non-alignment, they're very clear. They're saying we're not going to join any alliances. So that's
Yeah.
because the whole premise is they will align against other countries.
Yeah, and it is actually, it's absolutely true that on the face of it, you would think that neutrality is on the declining end, because we are so used to only look at Europe, and there it is declining clearly, and also in Switzerland. We're trying to do something a bit against this. I can talk about this maybe later, but it is not going well. But entire other parts are moving further toward this kind of idea of saying like, no, I'm not going to bind myself permanently with anyone. And we see the return not only of small states that try to be neutral, like let's say well, Malaysia is not a small state. Sorry, it's not a small state, but it's not a great power. But we see, as you said, China that officially rejects this. And I had at my last conference, I had a great academic, Yu Bin, and he argued out. He still argues today that China's approach toward the Russo-Ukrainian war is actually one of principled neutrality, because that's what makes most sense. And actually, China still has a good working relationship with Ukraine, and we see the return at the moment, even of a form of neutrality which we are not even aware that it ever existed, because it kind of faded away after the Second World War, and that is great power neutrality. In both of Russia's new treaties with North Korea and with Iran, in both of them there's a neutrality clause. It doesn't use the word neutrality, but the clause is very explicit. It says if any of the two contracting parties ends up in a conflict with a third state, then neither of the contracting parties will help the third state. That's a classic 19th century neutrality clause, and both of these, the North Korea, Russia, and Russia Iran treaty, have that clause inside it. And you can it actually Russia is and you wrote about that in the past as well in that book. Actually, Russia not only at some point wanted itself to be a neutral actor, at least in the early 2000s. But Russia has a long history of using such like pragmatic, great power neutrality agreements in order to balance its international relations. Most important example, the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact of 1941, which kept, the Russia and Japan didn't go to war until 45 when the Soviets broke the pact, but that kept their back free for 4 years. And in the 19th century, they used that a lot. Katharina the Great, she's the inventor of the so-called League of Armed Neutrality, had the idea of banding together neutral shipping, defending neutral ships against the incursions of the Brits and the French. And this is all a long story, but we are right now seeing the return of such great power like clauses, neutrality clauses. So it's not necessarily only alliances that matter again. Neutrality clauses and neutrality agreements are also on the rise at the moment.
Yeah, no, of course, and also non-alignment neutrality. They're not
Yes,
the same concept, but
closely
overlapping.
related.
Yeah, very related. But this is why it seems that we have learned the wrong lessons from what was done in Europe, because now that NATO is talking about setting up alliance systems in Asia, maybe not in the format of NATO. The former Prime Minister of Australia, he came out blistering attack saying this is wishing this is like wishing the plague. Why would we want this aggressive bloc politics when, as you also pointed out, when you have ASEAN, all this taking a neutral stance? And this is so important because the point of departure in any security analysis or security studies has to be security competition. That is this common sense. If you have one side enhancing its security, of course, is going to undermine the security of another. So states who abandon neutrality, this is why they tend to escalate tensions, and it will cause a counter reaction. And I think if we look in the context of what happened in Europe, it's
Yeah.
we of course neutrality is the word on everyone's mouth when it comes to Ukraine, because everyone realized that a peace agreement will need to entail restoring its neutrality.
Yeah.
But look how we got here. I mean, towards the end of the Cold War, our main objective was to create a Europe without bloc politics. We talked about indivisible security. This was the Charter of Paris for a new Europe. Yet um, we weren't able to replace the block system. Even, and this is why you mentioned, yeah, that book chapter had on Russia. And when we canceled the idea of a common European security architecture, the OSCE, they envisioned joining NATO simply because then it would be an inclusive format. It
Yeah.
wouldn't be a block system. And also a funny comparison to Ukraine would be in 2003, the Cossack memorandum in Moldova, the Russians helped to negotiate a unification between Moldova and Transnistria, which is the breakaway region. And they both agreed. Both sides made compromises. The one thing that was important for Transnistria was that they would have some autonomy to the extent they could veto things that would impact foreign policy and alignment. So this meant they wouldn't join NATO. Moldova said they were happy to do this. The president was boarding the plane. They were ready to go sign it. And then they get the call from the Americans and the Europeans saying, don't do it. It will undermine what they say, European future. Now, when they say European future, they mean blocks.
Yes.
You have to join our block because, yeah, and they effectively torpedoed the whole thing. So
Yeah.
they could have had unification back in 2003. And again, now it's been 22 years and they walked away from it.
Yes.
Again, this is what all the countries actually say this. If you when you put the polling in Belarus, do you want to line in a Russian bloc or Western bloc? If they have to choose, they go with Russia. But the majority doesn't want to be in a bloc. They would like to just not do either. Same
Yeah.
as Ukraine, by the way. All polling showed the same before 2014. They didn't want to be a part of any bloc. If they had to choose, they would prefer Russia, but overwhelmingly, they just want to be in the middle, not get entangled, and yeah, this was
And
not acceptable anymore.
yeah, and Georgia too. There's so many. Turkmenistan officially declared its neutrality and so on. And it is utterly clear that this is not what we are seeing. It's not a problem of who chooses what side. What we are currently seeing unfolding in and around Greater Europe or Eurasia is these two different ways of approaching world politics. One is the Anglo-European Anglo-American approach of the West of like forcing everybody into our camp, but not everybody, because you need a good enemy, right? Because you want to maintain that momentum. You don't let Russia join NATO. You don't create a bloc-free Europe. You create the enemy that you need in order to justify your own war state. And because, well, then it's easy to explain to your population, and you could see the glee in these warmongers when they managed when the war in Ukraine led to Finland and Sweden just abandoning their neutrality and joining their bloc. It's like, yeah, victory, got two of them, like, as if it was a scorecard. And that's one way of thinking. And the other way of thinking is how to create and I like the metaphor of the architecture, a security architecture, where interests are maybe opposed, but they work together to create something stable. And within a security architecture where different interests balance each other out in such a way, in such a place, neutral spaces and neutral strategies are actually very important to keep stuff together. And the prime example is Ukraine. I will never get tired of reminding people that Ukraine had a neutrality clause in its constitution until 2014. And the Maidan happened, then Russia realized that, okay, NATO is now trying to get our port in Crimea and Sevastopol. Then the Crimea was taken back. Then the entire electoral balance inside Ukraine was screwed up, and Ukraine was extremely angry, scrapped that article, replaced it with an article saying we want to join NATO. And from there, it only went worse. The Donbass rebelled against this. Russia supported it. The Minsk agreements were supposed to fix this. But we know today that a large part of neocons in the West just wanted to use more time in order to militarize Ukraine, which they did. And it just went from bad to worse. And the interesting thing is, of course, that the Russians never gave up on a neutral Ukraine, even until now. They are still saying you have to be neutral because, like, the Russians don't want to absorb Ukraine. They can't. This is a ridiculous proposal. The Europeans are just at the moment caught in this ideological stupidity, an utter like fantasy world of like depicting everything Russian as evil, and therefore they come up with these dumbest of dumb narratives. But all of that then helps them to keep the war going, and whereas other parts of the world, including Russia, want to find a way to have a common security approach and somehow stabilize regions. That's why, like, also the Iranian Russo-Iranian treaty is meant to stabilize that part of the world and stop this strategy of just laying waste to West Asia or the Middle East in order for Israel to have a cozy place to live in, where everybody else is living in despair. So you have that region for yourself. So all I want to say is that the approach is different, and this is why the Europeans are currently heavily, strongly anti-neutral, and the neutrals keep hearing the remaining neutrals because they don't go along all the way, right? Georgia isn't going along all the way. Switzerland and so on doesn't put sanctions, and the criticism is you are supporting the evil side. You need to be on the good side. So states that use neutrality as either as a policy or an security approach will always hear this, and it's usually the stronger party in a conflict that puts the most pressure on neutrals. Because like even during the unipolar moment, the US started cracking down on neutrals. It's not a coincidence that the entire gold affair of Switzerland, that all of that came out in the 1990s. That's when the US didn't have very much to do anymore with the Soviet Union, right? Because the Union was gone. And then literally, like one of the chief plaintiffs or prosecutors in the US, I forgot his name, Eisenstadt. He was asked, well, why 1995? Why in 1995 are you looking at the gold dealings of Switzerland with Nazi Germany? And his answer literally was like, oh, one of the reasons is because now we have more time. So you actually go back, you revisit what happened, and then you crack down on the other bastards, not the ones that we fought against, but the bastards who had the audacity not to fight with us. It's a natural thing actually to happen for in great power politics if you think about it, because belligerents always have two rivals. One is the primary enemy, the other one is the bastards who don't cooperate enough.
I'm glad you mentioned Georgia because this is also shows how everything is framed very misleading or falsely because the Georgian leadership is presented as being all Putinist and in Putin's pocket, but if they
They're
can
neutral.
join the
They're
EU,
just
they
pro
would do it
Georgia.
tomorrow.
That's all.
Yeah, that's it. They say, oh, we have to join the EU. We would like to. We did all the reforms. But we don't want to make ourselves into a front line. So we want to be neutral in this conflict. So okay, this is it, and it's not good enough. So if it doesn't join 100%, then it goes against. And this is the main problem. I think. Again, what is the point of departure when you pursue security policy? Do you attempt to mitigate security competition, or do you descend into this complete tribalism where it's us versus them, where if we strengthen and weaken the adversary, this will be security? Because it just proves this never works. And that's
Yeah.
why I think this example now of Scandinavia as well is so fascinating, because Scandinavia was a region of peace throughout the Cold War for good reason, not because it's a magical place. It's just had a lot of neutral states, and even Norway, the only country who, well, Norway and Denmark could join NATO nonetheless. Norway didn't accept any troops on its borders, on its soil, any bases, that is. It didn't want too much activity in the north. But now, as you also pointed out, when Finland and Sweden joined, how was this covered? It was, yes, now they're in the club, because they never wanted to join, and then the war starts. They're all startled because good reason to be fearful after the Russians invaded Ukraine. But suddenly, the polling goes up, and then just to go into NATO as quick as possible, and they're finally inside. But no one really explained how does this help security. Even NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said, "Well, Putin didn't want any NATO on his border. Now he has NATO in Finland and Sweden. Why is this a gain? How does this enhance our security?" You know,
No, no,
the
it doesn't. Let me just mention that Finland and Sweden are both now spiraling into something extremely worrisome. I interviewed on my channel Tuomas Malinen, and he said like the Finnish newspapers are full of articles saying what to do when the war comes, not if, when. And Sweden, I'll make an episode about this soon. In December, send out a brochure to every household telling them what to do in case of war, how to behave, where to go, and what the duties are, and so on and so forth. And within 2 years, these societies or these countries went from we are okay because we are not an enemy to anyone to we are now part of NATO, which was supposed to keep them safe, right? We joined NATO in order to be safe, and now they are preparing to go to war for NATO. So it's madness what's going on at the moment. I think we can explain it with like certain psychological approaches and so on, and of course like manufacturing consent and da 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 da. But the dynamic is extremely horrible, and it has to do with again a difference in approaching your own security. The entire ethos or ideology of the Anglo-American world, the Western world, is to use deterrence, right? Safety through strength. I have to deter the other one. And you can do this form of stupid like deterrence. You can only do by having the most powerful weapons or having the biggest alliance, right? You need to make sure everybody else is so scared of you that they never attack. And then the flip side of that is that then the temptation that you yourself go and attack just goes up and up and up. The approach of small neutral states or small neutral strategies is actually a different one. Neutral deterrence functions not through the big stick and small and big carrot. It functions through a small stick and small carrots. Small permanent neutrals, they know that they are vulnerable, but they still build up armies like Switzerland. Austria also had an army. Ireland has an army. They are aware that they cannot possibly completely fight off an invasion, but they can threaten that if you come, you will suffer. You won't get this for free. So the blood that we will demand in order for you to get us is quite high. But if you don't do that, then we trade with you, and you can get a lot of benefits from us without actually invading us. And a neutral strategy always tries to balance these two. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It's not a magical formula. There never is in IR. But the approach is a different one. Neutrals don't try to scare others into not attacking them. They try to actively befriend others in order to be safe, because you are never as safe as in an environment where nobody wants to attack you. If nobody
well,
wants to take you, then you have no problems. And that's something that NATO doesn't understand. I mean, they literally are incapable of thinking in those terms.
Well, yeah, that's why it's the Swiss World War II history is fascinating because it's in not just being neutral, but then it's not as if they were disarmed. They had a very powerful deterrent, and they're, it's very built in very strongly. So this was also one of the calculations of Germany. That is, well, the Swiss aren't a threat; they're not threatening us. But
Yeah,
if you try to take it, we can take it, but it's going to be a
yeah.
huge bloody mess. And what's the point if they're not actually threatening us?
Yeah,
And
why would you? And then after the war is done, Switzerland gets asked, why did you still deal with Nazi Germany, the enemy? And the Swiss then always need to explain, yeah, they were your enemies. And yes, that's not a moral position. It's not the moral high ground. Neutrals cannot never claim the moral high ground, but it is very important to understand that from the perspective of a neutral, those belligerents are not belligerents. Those belligerents are both your partner states. But this is something that, especially in the Western ideology, doesn't work. They will always try to go back to morals and to just war theory, with us or against us, good or evil. And we are good. Therefore, if you're not with us, then you are evil.
Yeah, I just want to circle very quickly back to the Finland thing, because for me this is the most shocking one, I guess, because this was really the the triumph of neutrality. You know, after all
Yeah.
their wars with the Russians, they establish well, what was going to be permanent neutrality after World War II, and suddenly instead of having conflicts, they don't represent anymore a front line and a possible route of invasion of Russia, or the Soviet Union, and suddenly relations are stable, and they actually have, yeah, peace. And now again, Finland was converted into now NATO's largest front line against against Russia, and it will become a self-fulfilling prophecy because they're already saying, "Oh, the Russians might one day come and invade northern Finland." So now they're going to have bases up there with American troops close to the northern fleet near Murmansk and Arkhangelsk of the Russians. Now, what is the Russians going to do? Again, there's security competition. You're going to have American bases with missiles, drones, all of this near one of its strategic naval bases. And knowing that the Americans' key security strategy is to contain other great powers' access to freely navigate the oceans, no, of course there will be a reaction. And then we'll say, oh, look, good thing we built this basis, good thing we joined NATO, and that we abandoned neutrality. And it's not just Finland and Sweden, it's the militarization of all of Scandinavia. It will militarize the Arctic, it will militarize the Baltic Sea. We even have now, all this talk about, well, no, it's not, neutrality when threatening anyone, there's defensive alliance. You already have the former NATO Secretary General, the Danish one, uh, arguing that Rasmussen's arguing that we can put a blockade now on St. Petersburg in case there's a conflict. We can like we're back in the Crimean War in the mid 19th century, and we can also put a lot of pressure now on Kaliningrad because they're landlocked, and now we can take the sea, Baltics, Poland, all of them referring now to the Baltic Sea as NATO Lake. I mean, this is really, really crazy stuff, and. Again, it's the same with Ukraine. You have this security competition. This whole idea that NATO was just going to roll up to the borders and suspend Ukraine's neutrality and build up missiles, have Ukraine align itself closer and closer to NATO, and somehow Russia would just have to accept it and more or less capitulate. It's with security competition. There's always going to be a reaction, and when you abandon neutrality, I mean, this is why buffer states was so important. People forget that throughout the Cold War, we had a whole belt of neutral states running from the north to the south. So Sweden, Finland, Austria, Switzerland. You put Yugoslavia in that camp as well. And indeed, Germany was the main area where the two parties would meet. And this is why a lot of tensions were there. But even Stalin said we can have unification back in 52 of Germany if they are neutral, so we make it a buffer state.
Yeah.
Of course, one can not take him on his word and be distrustful, but neutrality. Why did we throw this out as a discussion altogether? It's always
Again,
goes back to blocks. Block politics, zero sum power. This is going to be the source of security. It's very, very dangerous because it intensifies the security competition instead of mitigating it.
absolutely, absolutely right. And we threw it out for two reasons, and both of them are connected to this idea of how we produce security. Let me just like one word about Germany, because this is very important actually also for neutrality studies. In 52, 53, there was an offer on the table from Stalin, the Stalin notes, to reunify Germany, and make it neutral and assure that it would not join NATO. And there is an active debate actually on researchers. On one side, one group under Peter Rugenthaler who says like, no, Stalin never meant it because there's no documents in the Soviet archives that would show that he ever prepared for that eventuality. Therefore, he didn't mean it. Therefore, it was just a ploy. And then there's Michael Gayler, who wrote a 700-page book about it in German, saying like, no, it was completely meant seriously. It was just one of the several strategies that Stalin used at the same time in order to somehow get to a stable position. And this was absolutely meant serious. And the proof of that, as that the Russians meant it, and it was not so much Stalin, it was more Molotov. But the proof that it was meant serious is then that in 55 the Russians actually signed off on having a neutral Austria. But at that point, it was too late. Germany was already, I mean, West Germany was already being integrated into NATO, and that train had left. So in a sense, the Russians like realized too late that they could use a smaller state as an example in order to show that they're serious about this problem-solving approach. But sorry, to come back to the larger question, why we don't use these buffer state ideas anymore is because the idea of the the people, like call them neocons or call them like domination oriented ideologies, they want to impose peace by through structures and through mechanisms that they control or that they make. And the League of Nations and the United Nations were actually founded more or less under that idea. We impose peace top down. We create an organization. That organization is a world government, the Kantian dream of all nations united under one government. And then that's the policeman. And the policeman goes around, and whenever somebody falls out of line, it beats him back into line, right? And thereby we achieve peace. That idea is the opposite of how the 19th century was run and what the idea was with the people in 1815, at the Congress of Vienna, of creating a concert and a balance of power. The balance of power rests on not having a top dog, but having centers that then interact but do not disintegrate. And whenever you try to change the idea to a top-down structure, that's when you then have to whip everybody into place, including the neutrals. Now, neither of these approaches has ever managed to give us world peace, but especially in a world where multipolarity and like several power centers become just a fact of life, the top-down approach will not only not work anymore, it will, on the contrary, it will produce its own incentives in order for some groups to try even harder to impose their version of peace. The crazy thing is everybody wants peace, but we disagree on how to do it, right? And that's why in this world that we are going into, using neutrality and buffer, the approach of buffer states, again, in a smarter way, could help us to stabilize, or will help us to stabilize the world. But this is being actively fought against by one part. And funnily enough, the Russians actually understand that. They intuitively, I don't know whether intuitively or theoretically, they understand this very, very intricately. And this history of the Russians trying to balance Europe and Asia through neutrality agreements of their own and others goes way back. Switzerland wouldn't have gotten its permanent neutrality in 1815 had it not been for the Russians. The Russians sold it to the other great powers. And this country keeps forgetting that the entire time. It's completely out. But most neutral places in Europe are neutral because the Russians signed off on it.
Yeah, well, yeah, as you said, we tend to leave that part out. But I wanted to ask also the last one, I guess, on the whole ideology behind it, because how you obviously after the Cold War, distribution of power shifts. So during the Cold War makes sense. If you got two big powers, facing each other in Europe, it makes sense to have some neutral buffer state in the middle in order to prevent them from getting too close to each other and threatening each other. So again, you want, and this worked for both sides. But of course, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia goes from becomes weaker and weaker. There's not the same incentive anymore to accept this. So you create a European system based on collective hegemony. That is, one side should dominate. So this is NATO expansion. This is organizing, well, Europe in NATO and the EU, which essentially seek to exclude Russia, make it the largest country in Europe becomes the only non-European country. So it's a strange format, but the whole as neutrality was suspended, if you look back in the 90s, how how we begin to speak, because we no longer spoke about power politics and the need to deter without provoking. Instead, the argument was, well, it's a community of values, it's a community of democracy, it's a force for good, and it's if NATO establishes itself on Russia's border, Russia should be happy because then it will bring a lot of political stability and good governance, and will be good for Russia. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but this was the dominant argument. This is what they were saying. So very much this liberal hegemony argument that these were interdemocratic security institutions only, and we took out the whole power dimension, and. And again, I think in the midst of all of this, I remember Henry Kissinger coming in because he had some interesting comments towards the end of the 90s, because this whole idea that is community values on defensive alliance, all of this was very much at the foundation of why it wouldn't cause security competition by suspending a lot of neutral statuses, but it's important to see what happened to NATO as well, because you don't want to mention the deterrence. And you can argue that NATO's deterrence was more stable during the Cold War, because not only did we have the neutral buffer states, but it was a defensive alliance as well. But what happened after the Cold War, when there was no more balance against NATO, why would, again, as realists would say, states don't balance themselves. So if there's not check, they will begin to push out. So once the Soviet threat was finally gone, NATO instead then began to abandon its defensive alliance status by having what it called out-of-area operations, which effectively means using military force against other countries who usually have not even threatened you, and also expand. So they begin to use NATO aggressively and also expand the military alliance. And the fact that it did this within a 2-week span in 1999, that is to expand NATO and then less than 2 weeks later on attack Yugoslavia, this is when also Henry Kissinger came out. Well, now we can't, calm the Russians down, saying that we're just a peaceful defensive alliance. We are expanding and we're bombing one of their historically closest, brotherly people or historical allies. This will have consequences at some point. But nonetheless, the rhetoric, the way the politicians speak, it was nonetheless still no. But we're not here to assert the dominance in the Western Balkans. We're just here to defend human rights and values, and Russia should be happy. Imagine how much peace there will be. It's quite it's quite extreme that we don't assess how NATO as well changed, because a deterrent for a status quo power versus deterrence for a revisionist power, it's very different, because now we're trying to deter Russia from not responding to our revisionism. So we're going to expand NATO, and if they react to it, well, that's what we have to deter. They said this openly in the 90s, in the Senate debates, when expanding NATO. They said, yeah, well, it might unravel relations with Russia, but at least then we'll have NATO as an insurance guarantee in case relationship goes bad. Yes, a relationship might go bad with Russia, but at least they'll be surrounded by NATO, as if this was a good approach.
It's I mean, you point all of your guns at somebody, and then you are surprised that somebody will try to get guns themselves. It's like, and then you take that as a proof that your approach was right, because obviously the other one is not trustworthy. I mean, we understand that, right? That's the frustrating thing in IR. We have a name for it. It's the security dilemma, and this is utterly well understood. It is not rocket science. Nothing of what we are talking about is rocket science. It's more it's general understanding, which is actually why a lot of viewers of these programs, they're not academics, they're not diplomats, they're people in the street who just understand. I mean, normal everyday people who just think well, who know that this is not a smart way of dealing with other people. The one of these problems that happen and that we are in Europe is that in the 1990s and the end of that security competition and the unipolar moment led to this belief that then now our system will be the world system, right? And we for 30 years we talked about globalization, when in fact we meant westernization, right? And now everybody will use our approach, and Francis Fukuyama, I don't have to repeat that, right? But what was left out is that this is just not how things things completely work. And also, I mean, not only that there are other ideas around how things should be run, the Chinese and also the Russians, and plus like ignoring how horribly Russia suffered internally in the 90s, right? And this then reframing of little by little reframing of policies that are actually pro-war policies as pro-peace. And as you said, like NATO is not an aggressive alliance. It just goes out of area. It's out of area or out of business. They understood that very well. And they decided to go out of area. And this is the temptation, right? The temptation of power. If you have it, why don't we use it? All of these beautiful soldiers, come on. It's a waste of money if we don't, and what are they going to do? Right. And that's the temptation. And that's also a very European thing to do. And my criticism on John Mearsheimer is that his theory, especially when it comes to China, is built on the idea that the Chinese will act in exactly the same way. The Chinese, once they have enough economic and military power, they will use it. They will project it externally, which is what the Europeans, historically for the last 1,000 years, have been doing. And I am not sure about that. I mean, his theory says they will because it's the most natural thing to happen in great power competition. Jeffrey Sachs argues that no, this is just us projecting, and the verdict on that one is still will still have to come out in the future. But the point is, the Europeans act like that, and then they reframe and they invent these bullshit concepts. Another one bullshit concept is humanitarian interventions, right? We bomb other countries to smithereens in order to save their populations. And the responsibility to protect, that's a third one that goes together with that one. The idea that we now justify our interventions abroad because ours are benign, and even if a million people dies like in Iraq, it's still justified because we feel entitled to do so. B, the other guy was Hitler anyhow, right? And C, we're only doing it for the good of the Iraqi people. If a million of them dies, then as Albright once said, it was worth it. But it's still framed as something benign, right, and generous. And that's how the West then deludes itself into the moral high ground that you need if you want to do crimes, just like the crime of the genocide against the Palestinians at the moment in Gaza. You do that from the high horse by feeling that you're the good one, you're the goody, you're just helping the other one to defend itself. You're the shining the knight on a white horse. And 100 years later, once historians come about and like do the good work, and it then gets generally accepted that that was not a good idea, then it's too late. And the people who are dead are dead. And some governments might apologize, right? Just the way that the North Americans these days and Australians, they apologize for colonizing and killing and raping and plundering the indigenous people that they eradicated from, like completely, utterly eradicated from their continents. And then they start like putting little footers into their email addresses saying like, I hereby acknowledge the indigenous land, da 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 da, as a repentance or something. But these people are dead, right? It's not their land anymore. It's now white people land in North America. It's Europeans. Our cousins and so on took that thing over. But the moment you do it under this BS justification. And right now we're doing exactly the same again. We create BS justification in order to use horrible violence to suppress and to everybody else. And the other part of the rest of the world is still trying to figure out how to deal with that, because unfortunately we Europeans seem to be incapable of learning from our own aggressive genocidal past.
And well,
Sorry.
I guess I just one final comment would be that there's two sides as well of the abandoning kind of abandoning neutrality. Of course, on one side, as you spread the conflict, you escalate, and you provoke and threaten other countries as well, which gives them a reason to not return the favor, but that's how the security competition plays out. But on the other side of this equation is that by abandoning neutrality, you also, especially for small and medium-sized countries, you become very much dependent on your security provider, which for the Europeans now, was something that the Finns and the Swedes will also notice, are the Americans. And when you make yourself excessively dependent on another center of power, it turns out that they can abuse this power. So, and look at the position the Europeans are in now. If Nord Stream was blown up, that's just all, yeah, so more or less all 100% likely this is the United States, unless we buy their argument that it was actually the Ukrainians. And now, of course, you have Trump saying, yeah, I can take, we want Greenland. The Europeans are now shocked that he meant it. And but this is, well, what can the Europeans really do? And this is what happens when you make yourself so dependent on one center of power. They can say, you know, no more trading. No, you have to buy our gas, as Trump has said. We want your territory in Greenland. You should buy our technologies, even if they're more expensive and less efficient than the Chinese. Your foreign policy is now following us. And this is, yeah, loss of sovereignty. And this is what happens as well when you yeah, make yourself into a puppet of other countries. So
And
it's
And
no,
even
it's
even 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 worse, I mean, the worst, the country that has it the worst in all of Europe is, of course, Ukraine, because Ukraine was so vassalized and so put under the thumb of NATO that they managed to convince the Ukrainians to be the staging ground of the proxy war. And the rest of the Europeans are actually going in that direction, right? We all understand that if there was a nuclear exchange, the beginning of it would be European only. The question is, could you contain it on that one or not? But we know that American strategists plan with that, right? I mean, okay, in worse things worse, like we lose Europe, but okay, we can still beat the Russians through that. And right now, you have a smaller version of that with Ukraine. Instead of a neutral ground that does its own thing and trades with everybody, you now are a proxy, the ground for a proxy war, and that's like this huge tragedy, right? In abandoning neutrality or abandoning your own position in favor of serving the aspirations of other states really risks that you will be you will die. Many people inside will die, right? Because you're being enlisted, and that's what we are worried about with Finland and Sweden. That now the Nordics are being so militarized in order for NATO at some point to use them, right? You make them ready and then you use them. And if they're willing to go, if you manage to create the system, because Ukraine doesn't go because they're stupid. The Ukrainian political process was always very difficult. That the US over 10, 15 years managed to make it dependent on their on them running the show. I mean, Joe Biden, how he talked about forcing the Ukrainians to even throw out their chief prosecutor, right? This kind of dominance, because you're able to influence the political process through the NGOs and through embassies and through the networks that you create, right? And supporting some groups against others in order to create electoral imbalance. That is the great art of this kind of subversion, and they did that very successfully. And if then you lose your independence, well, you will be the staging ground for a proxy war.
yeah, that's my prediction will happen to Zelensky's. I think the Ukrainians will hold him accountable for not taking the offer of neutrality, because it's worth remembering that when the Russians invaded in 2022,
Yeah, yeah.
Zelensky confirmed that Putin contacted him on the first day, or the Russians at least, to negotiate a settlement, and based on neutrality, as he pointed out on the first day. And the Russians were willing to pull back, return their territory if Ukraine would restore its neutrality, which kind of punches a hole in the whole idea that this was a attempt simply to take territory. But anyways, this is they had this agreement in Istanbul, where based around this idea, we will pull our troops out and you will restore your neutrality. And then Zelensky, as well, as like I said on other podcasts as well, he says on an interview with The Economist that well, there's many Western countries who doesn't want this peace, who rather want a long war. And he argues, you know, even if they know this will destroy Ukraine and cost countless lives, he says this to The Economist in front of the cameras on an interview. And nonetheless, a few weeks later, he took the deal anyways, to make his country, to not restore neutrality, and instead use his own country to, in his words, because America saw it as a opportunity to weaken Russia in a long war, even if they were the instrument. And he recognized this in front of camera, and he took that deal anyways. And now, yeah, the country is being decimated in the most horrific way. And this is
It's despicable.
again,
It's
and
despicable.
this should be the key lesson. Like we should have rethink a bit about the value of neutrality. Instead, we use this as a reason to also suspend neutrality in Scandinavia and now go, yeah, full block politics. So it's
You,
very,
you
very depressing. Anyways,
You know,
Pascal.
this is just a final word. This is the only thing that I think I ever I could ever agree with Ursula von der Leyen. I'm using her sentence now, but I'm going to use it in a completely different context. Because for great power politics, actually, it's true. Nobody is safe until everybody is safe. We need to make sure that the other one is safe too, in order to enhance our own safety. And neutrality is one of these instruments in international politics to achieve the other safety and your safety, and in the process, develop something that won't end up in this horrific warfare which the Europeans have been doing for 2,000 years.
Yeah, so if one side doesn't have security, no one will have security.
Mhm. Yeah.
This has always been common sense. Well, why we have indivisible security, but again, we this all gone in the memory hole under liberal hegemony. So, anyways, Pascal, thank you so much for your time. I very much appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Glenn.